Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to have Jonathan Neville back on the show. We're going to continue our conversation in talking about his book, Infinite Goodness, and we're going to learn more about Jonathan Edwards' influence on the Book of Mormon. Specifically, what phrases does Jonathan Edwards use that are found in the Book of Mormon? We'll also talk about Jonathan's critics. What does he have to say about those who take offense to his book, Infinite Goodness, and he'll respond to those critics as well. And so you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out.
For me, it's like you have the Book of Mormon, and the Bible opens up parts of it. You know, there's allusions in the Book of Mormon to Moses and so on. And then on the other side, I have these allusions to Jonathan Edwards that are just beautiful and awesome. And they expand the Book of Mormon in that direction too. So you have the Book of Mormon, you have the Bible in one direction, you have Jonathan Edwards in the other direction that enhances it. Especially, and this is one of my key reasons for publishing this book, the Jonathan Edwards connection puts the Book of Mormon squarely in Christian tradition. It's part of Christianity. Because they, for the most part, evangelicals and maybe even Catholics, probably not Catholics, but the non-Catholic Christians look to Jonathan Edwards as one of the great spiritual leaders, right? He articulated a lot of really key concepts about Christianity. And so to see the Book of Mormon as the fulfillment of what Edwards was seeking is really a fantastic way to understand the Book of Mormon. And for example, Edwards talked about, I mentioned earlier, the restoration of the church in the latter days, and how the church would have this worldwide beauty and influence and so on. That's all happening in the LDS church. It's not happening anywhere else, really. There's no other church that is really focused on preparing for the second coming, for example, like we are. And Elder Christopherson gave a phenomenal talk about that a couple of years in General Conference about how nobody else is really preparing for the return of the Lord the way we are. And that's fulfillment of what Jonathan Edwards was anticipating and hoping for and seeking and trying to establish. So I see there's this idea that there was an apostasy, and then Martin Luther and Calvin and others, and then it progressed to the Restoration. But they omit the Jonathan Edwards key portion of that whole development. And I think he was kind of the impetus, or I've said he was like an Elias for Joseph Smith, because he laid the foundation or the premise for the restoration of the church in the latter days. He used that terminology. So when Joseph was reading Jonathan Edwards and understanding these concepts, he was prepared for a restoration. And there's a lot more I could say about it, but let me mention one other thing that dawned on me recently, and it's related to this, because there's a lot of criticism about the first vision, right? Joseph never told anybody about it until later in life and all that. Mm-hmm. Well, I wondered about that a lot, because there were lots of people who have claimed to have seen God and to have this, the born-again experience. But Joseph was reluctant to talk about spiritual things. And the way we know that is, even after Moroni visited him 3 times, went out to the field, he wasn't going to say a word to anybody. And the angel had to come to him and say, no, you have to tell your father, right? Because he'll believe you. Joseph's big thing was he was afraid people wouldn't believe him, so he didn't want to talk about it. And when I realized that a message from Moroni, you have to tell your father. That's an angel telling you to tell your father, to overcome his reticence to talk about these things. And so it made sense for me that he didn't talk about the first vision except to that one guy that rejected him. So he kept it to himself. So, and I don't think he even talked about it in the early days of the church, I don't think he talked about it to Oliver Cowdery. He didn't talk about it to his mother. His mother, in her history, never said anything about it. And when she did the history of Lucy Mack Smith, mm-hmm. she went right to Moroni's visit. Nothing about the first vision. And then when they did the second, let's say the second version of her history, they inserted Joseph Smith's testimony about the first vision. They never had Lucy say it because he never told her about it. But that makes sense to me because of what Moroni had to tell him to tell his father, because he wasn't going to do it otherwise. And I think Joseph himself said, no man knows my history, right? So everybody who says, well, Joseph did this or thought this, to me that's just speculation, including with the stone in the hat stuff. So I just went back with a fresh slate. I said, I'm going to start from scratch. And I'm going to look at the text of the Book of Mormon, getting back to where we started a little bit, and see if I can figure out how Joseph would have, if he really translated it like he said, he had to acquire that language somewhere. And I think I've shown that that language was readily available to him. Not just the words, like some of my critics said, well, intertextuality is more than just a word here and a word there, and I agree. It's a couple of things. It's a word, it's terminology, but it's phrases and it's concepts that are intertextual. And I use this one of the natural man is an enemy of God because that's a really clear one that anybody can see. But there's many others in there as well.
So natural man is an enemy to God, that's Jonathan Edwards' phraseology.
Yeah, oh, totally, yeah. It's an allusion to that sermon, I think, anyway. A continual scene of wickedness and abomination, that's a Jonathan Edwards thing. I have a long list.
So just looking at the table of contents, you can kind of see some of the Edwards phraseology. We've got infinite goodness, which is the title. Let's see, natural man is an enemy to God, fire and brimstone, preparatory state. I mean, you've got a lot of the phrases right in there.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit more about that? What are some of the, well, not only that, but it seems like even the first vision uses a lot of Edwards phraseology.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the critics are going to say Joseph Smith's just ripping off Jonathan Edwards.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I mentioned earlier that Joseph didn't adopt Edwards' theology at all. And that's a key point, I think, because if he was ripping off or plagiarizing Jonathan Edwards,
we'd still be Trinitarians, right?
Yeah, and he would have used Edwards' theology as well.
Because there's another point of view, Dan Vogel, among others, that have said, well, Joseph's theology changed, the first vision changed to support his newer theology, because a lot of people read the Book of Mormon and say it's Trinitarian, or you could even say modalistic if you're being technical.
Well, it's mainstream Christian.
Yeah, mainstream Christian. And so it seems like, I mean, let's take the Dan Vogel argument for a minute.
Okay.
Book of Mormon's modalistic, let's just say, Trinitarian essentially, and Joseph's theology evolved. So at the beginning, he was using Jonathan Edwards, and then he started having these other revelations and things, and then he basically discarded it. Could we argue that?
Yeah, well, don't forget Brigham Young I think it was, I don't remember the date, but it was 1850s to 1870s, said if the Book of Mormon was translated today, it would read much different than it did originally. And that's because when Joseph Smith translated it, like any translator, he used his own lexicon and his own concepts to render what the Nephites had said. I don't think the Nephites used, as I said, the phrase natural man is an enemy to God. That was Joseph's translation of what they actually said. And so he was limited in that sense to what his own lexicon had. You know, the Bible says the Holy Ghost will bring all things to your remembrance, right? So that's how inspiration works, is the Lord draws on your own mind and your own words to express things to you. That's why if you're a member of the church in France and you get an answer to prayer, it's not going to be in English, right? It's going to be in French, because that's what your mind is, or Chinese, or whatever your language is. And so for Joseph Smith to receive revelation or to translate a text, the Lord had to speak to him after the manner of his own language, like the scriptures say. And so when he was a 17, 19, 22-year-old young man, his understanding of the gospel, let's say, or of God, was confined by the Christian context that he was living in. But as he received more revelations after that, his understanding expanded. So I think if he had retranslated the Book of Mormon in 1844, it would have read differently. Forget what Brigham Young said, But Brigham Young was right. I think if the Book of Mormon is translated today, it would read differently still. And so Vogel's argument was that Joseph was, as I understand it anyway, he was kind of absorbing ideas that he heard from Swedenborg or whoever, and was kind of developing a new theology as he went. That's one way to frame it. But you can take the exact same evidence and frame it as Joseph Smith growing in spiritual understanding and having greater insights. Now, the interesting thing about the first vision is I started getting into that. I haven't published a paper I've done on this, but
well, you did talk a little bit about it in here.
A little bit, but there's more to it. And so, for example, in his first 1832, he says the visit of angels, I think he said, and he was kind of tentative about talking about that whole experience with other people. And it wasn't until 1838 where he said, okay, here's what happened. There were two personages, God the Father, Joseph, and Jesus Christ, and here's what they said and all that. That was at the point where the church was big enough and he felt safe enough that he could tell the whole experience. Prior to that, he was familiar with what happened to Stephen, the martyr, who said he saw Christ, or I think it was said he
Jesus
saw,
on the right hand of God.
Yeah, and he got stoned to death, right? And that's kind of had to have been in Joseph's mind as he thought about, what do I tell people? Because he'd been shut down when he talked about the first vision the first time, right? And I could see how Joseph in his own mind, but even the Lord inspiring or guiding him, would tell him, don't get too explicit about this until the church is big enough. The Doctrine and Covenants talks about church has to be, reach a state, what was the terminology? Anyway, the church has to grow big enough to be solid before a lot of things could happen. It was a fledgling little group that could have been extinguished easily in the early days. And so, taking the same facts that Dan Vogel uses for his narrative, I would take the same facts and say, here's another narrative. That Joseph had the first vision experience that he described in 1838, but he was reluctant or prevented from talking about it in detail until the church had reached a point where it could survive without him. And sure enough, a few years later, he was killed, right? So if the first thing he had done is says, God the Father, Jesus Christ, two separate beings, they came to me, they told me all this, maybe he would have been killed, who knows? And so I think it was wisdom for him to be wise as serpent, so to speak, to not disclose everything he knew at the outset, but kind of a line upon line thing. We're going to introduce the Book of Mormon as a new scripture, some additional revelations, and then the Doctrine and Covenants came out of that, the whole Joseph Smith translation, which he never finished anyway, and the Book of Abraham, to the extent he intended that as scripture, that's unknown, because he certainly never published it as scripture. So a lot of things were progressing as he learned more. And what I really like about this approach is Joseph Smith was not this blank slate that the Lord told him everything, but he was just like you and I. I mean, he became the prophet and translator because he spent all those years studying Christian terminology, practicing to be a preacher, like you said, preparing himself, really. And how much of that was directed by the Lord and how much was internal to Joseph Smith? He just had this inborn, innate kind of a sense of mission, maybe, that caused him to do it. Maybe it was his early near-death experience with the leg surgery that kind of prompted him to be a religious seeker, wanting to know more, having a more intense desire to know than other people. I know I had a near-death experience myself, and I know how much that can really change your perspective and your outlook on reality even, much less just religion, reality itself. It gives you a whole different understanding of it. And so I see Joseph Smith as a completely viable, credible, believable source in everything that he did. And it all makes sense to me the way I frame it. What I don't like is people who promote a narrative by excluding certain facts. And that's where I object to a lot of the stuff that the Stone and the Hat people say, or even some of the Dan Vogel critics. Because they say, just as example, I keep hitting on this in my blogs and stuff, is that everybody ignores what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery said. They say, well, Joseph said he translated by the gift and power of God. That's in the Gospel Topics essays, and that's all they say. They omit that he said by means of the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates. They just totally omit that. And in my the critics that wrote about me in the Interpreter, there's a group of them that kind of got together and criticized everything. And I read through that and I said, these guys are missing the entire point. I mean, how you have what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery said, it's as clear as words can be. And then you have what other people said. And how do you reconcile those two? I reconcile it by saying I believe what Joseph and Oliver said, because I think the evidence that the Book of Mormon is a translation, not a composition, is pretty compelling with the Hebraisms and all that. But also, I can understand why other people would have said what they said about the stone in the hat, because they never saw the plates. They never actually observed a translation. And so they were inferred that they saw it, they believed they saw it, whatever, and they reported what they saw combined with their inferences. And so for me, it's easy to reconcile the two narratives. Other people say, well, one like Royal Skousen, for example, I brought Royal's book here. This is the history of the text of the Book of Mormon, part 5, the King James quotations in the Book of Mormon.
Wow.
And this is a great book. I really, in fact, I think this is one that, he didn't sign this one, but he signed some of the other ones that I got, because I love these books. But I read them with a little bit of skepticism, because he just assumed that the biblical language in the Book of Mormon came from the King James Version. That was just a bald assumption. He didn't consider that it may have also come from Jonathan Edwards and other Christian writers.
Oh, I was going to say David Hall had mentioned an earlier version than King James. I'm trying to remember what the name of it was. But there's an earlier than King James.
Yeah. I know what you mean. It's the early modern English thing. It's I don't know if it's earlier than King James, but it's like. Anyway, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about it for a while, so I don't remember exactly which one. But because of Stan Carmack's thing about early modern English, right?
Right.
And I understand that, and I think what he and Royal did was important to show that Joseph didn't just plagiarize the late war, for example. In that sense, it was an important contribution. And I appreciate what he did here, his analysis of the King James. But right in here, he says the English translator was not Joseph Smith, because he says it was this mysterious, unknown incognito. He doesn't use that term, but he said Joseph didn't translate the Book of Mormon into English, someone else did. And to me, I think, well, and Royals also said that Joseph and Oliver deliberately misled everybody. And to me, that's a non-starter, because if they misled everybody about that, then all bets are off. You might as well go with William on his thing about the...
Or stone in the hat.
Or stone. Well, those guys go with the stone in the hat. And that's the thing that really surprises me, that the whole church has kind of shifted away. Well, not the whole church. The scholarly section, the tiny handful of scholars, have moved away from believing what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery said to believing what David Whitmer said. That's the real dichotomy between those two. So some people like Michael McKay tried to bridge that gap by saying when Joseph and Oliver talked about the stone or the Urim and Thummim, they really meant the stone in the hat, because of that Wilford Woodruff journal entry. But if you look at Brigham Young's journal entry from that same meeting, he made a clear distinction between the Urim and Thummim and the seer stone. So even using their source, it doesn't fit. But worse than that, David Whitmer and Emma both clearly distinguished between the Urim and Thummim and the stone. They were two completely separate things. So to say that while everybody else made a clear distinction, but Joseph and Oliver didn't, really doesn't make sense to me.
Let me ask you one other thing, because I know I wasn't able to attend your MHA session. I think you were with Marianne Clements and another fellow.
Yeah.
And what I heard was the respondent didn't like your explanation. Can you talk about what they objected to? And
well,
what
I understood they objected to was they thought that I was only presenting a chapter out of this book. And the idea of MHA is you're supposed to present new material. And what I didn't explain clearly enough was I had released the database behind this book. And that was the new thing I was supposed to talk about at MHA, was the database. Because in here I have just a few examples. Here was I have a table in here of a few examples. There's a few hundred actually, I guess. But this is in this book there's a list of 1,142 words and phrases that are non-biblical that are in Jonathan Edwards' work. But this is just a list with numbers. The database, I have the actual scriptures and I have the quotations from Jonathan Edwards. And it's far more extensive than this now. And so I wanted to make that public. So I released it in connection with Mormon History Association. But I didn't make that clear enough, I guess, or something. And so, but I was introduced, because I hadn't spoken about this at MHA before, so in order to explain the database, I had to explain why Jonathan Edwards was important, which was stuff from this book. So the criticism I got in the short term was, well, you're not supposed to come here and talk about your book, you're supposed to talk about new material, because this is an academic conference, right? Then the commentator said something, I don't remember all, I haven't watched it again, that was in June, I think.
Yeah.
But he said something like, well, just because there's a few words in common doesn't mean intertextuality.
Right.
And I said, well, yeah, I know, I said that right in the book. That's some words is not intertextuality because it's a common language. Everybody uses those words or it wouldn't be a common language. So just because, but my focus was on non-biblical language, so I was limiting it to that. But it was more than just words, it was concepts and phrases, And they said that, I don't even remember the name of the moderator, but he worked in the church history department.
Was it Ash or?
Mark Ashurst McGee, I think.
That's who it was.
It might have been him. I don't remember. Sorry, Mark, if it was you. but he did acknowledge that if there's longer phrases like this natural man is an enemy to God, then that's more indicative of intertextuality. And so that's what I've been focused on. Well, I have examples in the book, but there's other examples that I've come up with since. And I totally agree. I understand intertextuality and what that means. And that's why I think that the idea of the plagiarism from the late war is ridiculous, because they were taking isolated phrases and combining them to make them look like they were one text. And I have never done that. That doesn't even make sense. But it's an example of if Joseph Smith was translating war chapters, he would draw on his own lexicon about war, which was War of 1812, the late war. Naturally, I mean, I don't see how anyone could expect a translator to come up with terminology that he was not familiar with. It just doesn't make sense, and it doesn't happen. And so, all these indicia that other sources that Joseph drew upon to translate, to me, are evidence that he translated. Now, I acknowledge it could be also evidence of composition, right? So. But any evidence of composition that Dan Vogel comes up with is also evidence of translation. That's how it works.
You said that last time.
Yeah, exactly. So, I've read Tolstoy only in translation. I've never read the Russian because I don't understand Russian a little bit, but not enough to read, And so for me, if I read a translation of Tolstoy, whoever the translator is, as far as I'm concerned, is the author, because those are the words that I'm reading, right? And the author had to draw on his or her own lexicon themselves. So I look at the Book of Mormon as one of the best examples of a translation we have, because it was written, it was dictated in the language of the translator, And the Lord even said, after the manner of his language. I just don't see how more explicit this could have gotten. The only thing I wish Joseph and Oliver had done was to say, they did say that book, Mormonism Unveiled, was a bunch of lies. They specifically said that about that book. But I wish they had said, this page in that book was a total lie, And they didn't get that explicit about it. But.
Right. What about, and I know I need to let you go here pretty quick, but like anachronisms.
Yeah.
Horse versus taper and silk and gold.
Well, horse versus taper. Taper has nothing to do with anything as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. Well, there are no horses in America, are there?
Well, that horse thing
before the Spanish came?
That's a little bit of a tangent again, but we can talk about that a little bit, because that study, there's an article in BYU Studies that explained that there's no explanation for how the horses that the Indians were riding came from the Spanish, because the Spanish primarily brought stallions, I think, and there weren't enough horses to produce the variety of horses that the Native Americans had. Do you remember that?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, there's an article in BYU Studies about that. And there's a whole narrative about how there were horses here before the Spanish came. And, there's evidence of dead horses here. I mean, dead horses. Prehistoric, let's say, or at least pre-European colonialism horses. Question is, when did they go extinct?
Right.
And that's a difficult thing to decide, because the only time a scientist ever knows that a particular dinosaur lived in a particular place is if they find a fossil, right? Presumably there were dinosaurs all over the place, but there aren't that many fossils. They're kind of rare, actually, but the dinosaurs weren't rare. Just like today, if you go out in the forest, if bones lasted a long time, it'd be littered with deer bones and possums and raccoons and everything, because bones dissolve and go away. They're only preserved under a few finite circumstances. That's what makes fossils. And so there could have been horses here that died, their bones dissolved, so we don't have evidence of them. I don't think that it's like proving a negative to say that there were no horses here.
Silk.
There's lots of silk. I mean, in the Hopewell things, they had silkworms. I mean, that's pretty common.
What? Really?
Yeah, sure. And they had, what's the other, pearls? They had freshwater pearls. What's a chariot? You get into that whole discussion. It's partly, to me, that gets into this idea of it not being a literal translation. The only thing we know is a literal translation was the title page. But an example is, since I'm an artist, I've been interested in the history of biblical art. And in the Middle Ages, Rembrandt and those guys would paint biblical scenes using contemporary costumes and people, right? So they didn't travel, at least he didn't travel to the Middle East and see what it was really like. He read the Bible and interpreted it according to his own culture. And there's lots of examples of that. And so whatever was in the original plates, Joseph translated according to his syntax, let's say, or his lexicon is a better word. And so whether it was a chariot or a procession kind of thing, where they would hold the guy up, or some other mode of transportation, he translated as chariot. But I'd like to have anyone tell me what that chariot looked like. No, Dan Vogel can't tell you what the chariot looked like, right? It's just a word, and it has to be interpreted. And it was a word Joseph used to translate whatever the Nephites were using. Dan Vogel likes to talk about this mound builder myth, too. And I promised Steve Peinecker I would tell him about the myth of the mound builder myth.
The myth of the mound builder?
Yeah, I mean, I understand where Dan's coming from on the mound builder thing, but now we're kind of digressing away from the Jonathan Edwards. But let's say it's just relevant to the translation. So any of the objections that you list that are listed in the CES letter or in Dan Vogel's works about the Book of Mormon, for me, they're easy to resolve once you accept Joseph Smith as a translator. Or you could even say if he composed it would have read the same way, like I talked about before.
Author and proprietor.
Yeah. And any evidence of composition is evidence of translation as well. But is there evidence of translation that contravenes the idea of a composition? I think there's plenty of it. And not just the Hebraisms, which I know people have explained away as well. But the sophistication of the whole narrative is pretty remarkable. The evidence, for example, that he would not have to have it read back to him the next day when he was starting to translate again, that's evidence that he was translating a manuscript, so he didn't need anyone to read it back. He didn't even have to remember what he translated the day before, because he was translating something new the next day. What are some of the other objections? Well, you mentioned anachronisms. To me, anachronisms are easy to explain if it was a translation. Now, here's the thing with the stone in the hat. If it was a stone in the hat and some supernatural person, whether John Wesley or whoever, or some Moroni learned English and did it or whatever, whoever was the supernatural translator should not have had anachronisms and and errors of grammar and all that stuff. To me, that's a contradiction, self-contradictory, to say that this divine, all-knowing translator produced all these errors in the text. That makes no sense to me at all. But if Joseph Smith was a translator, you would expect to have those errors. And furthermore, you would expect him to go back in 1837 and 1840 and correct those to the extent he had time to do that. And so that's what a translator does, you know. Even me as an author, when I go back and correct it, I try to correct errors that I find. I found a few in this edition, you know. But since I was the author, I'm allowed to do that. If I had translated it, I'd do the same thing, only the nature of the changes would be different, I think, if I was the translator as opposed to the author. Because Joseph was, when you read through it, you see the corrections that he made, and they look like the kind of corrections that a translator would make. A translator would say, oh, you know, I translate that way, I should have done it this way. Or he was using this which instead of who, you know, those kind of things. One other, just tangentially, I think it's in this book, and maybe the other one, where it says, or in other words, often. And the Bible never uses that phrase. But the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, uses it quite a bit. But Joseph also used it in his own writings. And Jonathan Edwards used it a lot too, that phrase. And that's another example of someone I think is translating ancient records or receiving revelation and trying to think of different ways to say what the impression is. And so whenever I read, I know some people say, in other words, was Mormon making a change on the plates, right? And that's, I'm not saying that's not possible, or not plausible or possible.
I hate to say this, but John Hamer always says, or in other words.
Yeah.
That's one of his key phrases.
Yeah. Well, it's a good way. It's a good thing because our language is so imprecise.
Right.
It's helpful to say, or in other words.
Right.
And to me, that was one of those little indicia of Joseph as a translator. Translating it one way and then realizing he didn't get it right, saying, or in other words. And the funny thing to me, I can see Oliver Cowdery sitting there writing out, or in other words, when Joseph was thinking, don't write the first thing I did, write the second, you know. But he was just taking it verbatim. You know?
Right.
So, and I think I talked about that in this book or the other one about the indicia that it's a translation, not a composition. And so, for me, the Jonathan Edwards stuff is awesome because it just expands the text, gives us a better context, and hopefully it makes the Book of Mormon more acceptable to non-LDS, or let's say non-Restoration Christians. Because I think Christians in general can benefit from the Book of Mormon. And I've said this before, but I feel like, not that it's a mistake, but maybe it was a little bit of a mistake to focus on it just as a missionary tool. Because the title page doesn't say join any church. It says to remind people of the covenants, that the Lord's covenants, and to convince people that Jesus is the Christ. As long as people are convinced Jesus is the Christ, I think it's fulfilled its purpose, whether they join the church or not. Now, obviously, the covenants are in the church, and that's an element of it. But Moroni never said you had to join a particular church. And so I think that if we can help Christians understand that the Book of Mormon is another testament of Jesus Christ, number one. Maybe number two, number three is evidence of the divinity of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But number one, it's a testament of Jesus Christ. We should all embrace that. And there's no reason to fight against it, really.
You sound like Steve Pinecker.
Yeah, well, I mean, we agree on a lot of things, you know. So, and then I was going to show this too. This is a Jonathan Edwards Encyclopedia.
Okay.
So because there's books like this, I don't need to write one for LDS people. But let me just mention one other thing about Jonathan Edwards. People don't realize that...
By the way, for those who are audio listeners only, they don't know what the name of that book is.
Okay. It's called the Jonathan Edwards Encyclopedia.
Right.
By Harry Stout, S-T-O-U-T, was the general editor. And it's awesome. There's I mean, if you start looking into Jonathan Edwards, there's voluminous books written about him as well as his own books. But early on in this, I was talking to Richard Bushman about all this stuff. And people don't realize that his first two published papers were on Jonathan Edwards. That's who he studied early on. And hopefully this is an author record, but he told me that when they were starting the Joseph Smith papers, they engaged the people from the Jonathan Edwards papers at Yale to consult, because the Jonathan Edwards project in Yale is one of the world-class exemplary studies of a particular person's work.
Oh.
And they wanted to use their knowledge and experience to help with the Joseph Smith papers. In fact, one of those Yale editors is still on the board of the Joseph Smith papers. And Richard told me, you should have been around here 15 years earlier when we started this, because we had considered doing a combined database of the two, but we didn't know there was a connection. And now you've kind of shown the connection here. And he introduced me to the people at Yale. And one of the things that I found in doing this research is their database omits a big section of Edwards' work. At least the search function.
The Yale database.
The Yale database. And so I told them about it, and they had no idea. And I gave them some examples. And this is why I do cross-referencing all the time, because I would do my search of my 1808 original book, right? And then I would look at the Yale database, and I would find stuff in here that wasn't in the Yale. And so I told them about it, and they thanked me, and they said, yeah, we're revising our search function. Hopefully we'll catch all that, and so on. So, but I don't think LDS people generally understand the significance of this connection between Jonathan Edwards and Joseph Smith. It's really exciting for me, anyway. And for me, it's faith-affirming. And of course, critics can twist anything, right? But I think the idea that the early church artwork was false is false itself. You know, I think the early artwork was based on what Joseph and Oliver said. What's a better source, right? And now we see all this artwork from these BYU artists and stuff with the stone in the hat. And to me, they're illustrating Mormonism unveiled. I mean, why? So it's a question of kind of what makes sense. I have a new book coming out, hopefully before the end of the year, called The Rational Restoration, where I summarize all this stuff, but I point out that everybody can agree to the base facts. And then we make assumptions based on those facts. We build assumptions, inferences, our theories, and our hypotheses, which the acronym is FAITH, right? Called the FAITH model. And I hope that I can explain it well enough for people to take any critic, any faithful argument, whatever, and plug it into this formula and see how it was derived. So, for example, with Dan Vogel, I mentioned earlier, you can take the same facts and have different narratives, right? And it's the same with the stone in the hat material. We can all agree that David Whitmer said this. And I totally agree, he said that. But does that mean that what he said actually happened? Does it mean that what he said was not a combination of what he inferred and what he observed? And I try to tease those two things apart, because what someone observes is completely legitimate to discuss, an observation. What someone infers or believes or heard from someone else or whatever is less credible, let's say. And if you make that distinction, then it's easy to reconcile what they said with what Joseph and Oliver said. And I think, in my view, the Jonathan Edwards stuff totally supports the translation narrative and refutes the stone in the hat. Unless the stone in the hat was quoting Jonathan Edwards, I guess. Which, if we knew the identity of the stone in the hat teleprompter guy, whoever wrote the teleprompter for the stone in the hat, that would help a lot, right? But I don't agree with Skousen and Carmack on that. I love their data. All their data is phenomenal. But their conclusions, to me, don't make sense, okay? But it's another example of there's a set of facts, and then you make assumptions. Skousen's assumption is Joseph Smith didn't translate it. Mine is he did. And everything that flows from that is based on those assumptions. We agree on all the facts, Now, I don't know if he agrees with me on the facts of Edwards' influence on the Book of Mormon, because I don't think he's ever even considered that. He's never even heard of it before, because he just assumed it was from the Bible. But that's an assumption, again, that is kind of unstated. And it's just a bald assumption that it all came from the Bible. And that's the kind of thing I like to probe and examine and think about. And I'm perfectly willing to say I was wrong if someone shows that I'm wrong about something. I was wrong about believing Mesoamerica for 30 or 40 years, right? And I used to teach it. I used to be an advocate of it. I went down to Central America and saw all this stuff, And so I'm susceptible to making mistakes like anybody else. And I just like to put out these new ideas, have people consider them. But mostly I want to employ this faith model so that we can assess these multiple working hypotheses and understand where they came from. And in the case of Richard Bushman's book, Rough Stone Rolling, that you mentioned at the beginning, make the distinction between what he says is a fact and what is actually a fact. And that's, I guess, the takeaway of this whole thing is for people to make up their own minds based on the facts and assess people's assumptions, motivations, and so on to support their hypotheses. Make up your own. I think everybody that I've shown that isn't just out to criticize me no matter what I do really likes this Jonathan Edwards stuff. And I say stuff informally, but it's really a beautiful, exciting new approach to the Book of Mormon from my perspective. And I hope people take a
And
take
you
a
said
look.
Richard Bushman endorses, or I don't know if it's endorses.
No, not this one. We've talked about this book privately, but and that's all I'll say about that. But the book that is coming out soon on the translation, he's given us a blurb for that. And, yeah. So, and you'll see that on the book.
We'll have to have you back on then, I guess.
Yeah. Me or Jim Lucas is my co-author on that.
Okay.
And he's much more accessible because he lives in Salt Lake now.
Yeah.
So,
I'll have to get you and him together at the same time, I guess.
Sure.
So.
That'd be great.
Well, cool. Well, I know I've kept you too long, but that's what happens when we.
That's what happens.
Here, so.
You're a good questioner. You're an indulgent questioner. Okay.
All right. Well, Jonathan Edward Neville, I appreciate you being here on Gospel Tangents.
Well, thanks for having me, and I hope your listeners enjoyed the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Okay, sure. Anytime.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jonathan Neville. Jonathan, thank you so much for sitting down with me and talking about your book, Infinite Goodness. It's a fantastic book, so you should check it out. In our next conversation, I'm excited to have Paul Toscano back on the show. We're going to talk about his experience being a part of the September 6th.
I get converted from Catholicism to Mormonism in 1963, and then 30 years later, 1993, I'm excommunicated. And so after 30 years in the church, I'm booted out, and this tells about how that happened and about my personality that would kind of lend myself to being excommunication material.
If you like what we're doing here on Gospel Tangents, please become a paid subscriber at gospeltangents.com or patreon.com/gospeltangents. We've got full transcripts on our website at gospeltangents.com. And if you'd like to check out some of our other conversations, click over here. Thanks.